Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have been not released to the internet. You can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Megan Lewis, welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. Just for those who don't know, we've already recorded these and somehow the files got corrupted. So we're back at it. And the first question I figured we would discuss today is the importance of royal inscriptions. Me and your wonderful husband, we're going into all sorts of stuff, and royal inscriptions get brought up a lot on like why we wouldn't want to trust them as like absolutely accurate, but what are they? And maybe you can tell us about the history of royal inscriptions.
Sure. So royal inscriptions are found pretty much throughout the whole of cuneiform culture. So some of the, not the very earliest, but some of the earliest cuneiform we have, all the way through to like the latest stuff in the very early ADs, are royal inscriptions. And all that really means is they are inscriptions that were commissioned by the king or a member of the royal family. Their subject matter ranges from building commemorations to records of the laws they enacted and the marvelous battles that they fought. So kind of runs the whole gamut of like royal propaganda essentially. And you find them mainly in like temple and palatial complexes. There are inscriptions that are put on little figurines or on small tablets and then buried underneath the foundations of temples. Which is part of the building ritual, and actually that was really important for like kingship in general. Kings were expected to restore temples, so that meant you had to tear them back down when they got damaged, find the original foundations, because keeping them the same was really important. So you find the original foundations. In a lot of cases, they found the original foundation inscriptions. They unearthed them. They rebury them with their own additional inscriptions saying, I found this, I put it back the way it was supposed to be, and then they rebuilt the temple. So you find them a lot in those contexts. You also find them built into temple walls. So you have inscriptions that are inscribed on stamps that are then stamped into bricks and used for building projects. You find those in palaces as well. And you also, in later periods, find really extensive inscriptions, especially in the Neo-Assyrian period, which is like the first millennium BCE. And those who are familiar with the Bible are probably familiar with like the Neo-Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians. By this point, royal inscriptions kind of reach the pinnacle of complexity. They're really long, elaborate descriptions of the things that the king has done for the gods, for the betterment of his empire, like military campaigns. And they're very often inscribed across the walls, especially of palaces. And you find them in conjunction with these beautiful carved reliefs that show like gods and deities, beautiful figures, but also, especially in the Neo-Assyrian period, you find them inscribed with scenes of quite atrocious warfare. So siege warfare, you've got soldiers flaying enemies alive. There's one relief which is always sticks in your mind is the king, the Neo-Assyrian king, reclining in his garden. I think one of his queens is there. Beautiful picnic, and just an enemy's head casually hanging from a tree next to him. So they kind of, they're all over the place. But they're important because they provide essentially an official record of how the kings enacted kingship and also how they wanted to be seen by people. And that last bit is really crucial for our understanding of them today. It's not like picking up a newspaper, essentially. Yes, they'll have historical record. It will tell you of things that did actually happen, but they're very much framed in propaganda. Like, they're there to tell everyone what a great king this guy is, how powerful he is. And going back again to the Neo-Assyrians with those terrifying reliefs that I mentioned, they're there to kind of warn people. So they wouldn't have necessarily been visible to your average person just out and about. in Mesopotamia, but they probably would have been visible to emissaries from other nations and from like vassal states, people who were ruled by the Assyrians. So you're walking through this palace on your way to see the king, deliver your official message, and there are these like horrific reliefs of what happens essentially when people rebel against the Neo-Assyrians. So you're looking at that, even if you can't read the inscription, you think to yourself, these are not people I want to mess around with. Maybe we should just behave ourselves, pay our tribute, go back home, and not rebel, because that would be very dangerous for our health.
Interesting. I know one of the points you've brought up, and I'd like for you maybe to comment if you don't mind, is the idea of one of these kings who really killed someone to become king, and then there's a political propaganda here in the royal inscription, like he was supposed to be king. And like, can you give us the king's name and like what he's trying to do?
Yeah, sure. So that's Sargon, Sargon the Great, who was the first king of a dynasty called the First Akkadian dynasty. And he's really interesting because he essentially founded the very first empire that you see in world history. He united northern Mesopotamia and southern Mesopotamia into one empire, which you don't see before him. Before that, or you have really a small city-states that war with each other, make treaties, but no one really controls an extensive area. So he changes all that. He was not from a royal family, we don't think. His name, Sargon, in Akkadian is Sharukin, which means the king is legitimate, which is a really interesting throne name to choose, and probably points to the fact that actually he wasn't legitimate in traditional terms. He wasn't like next in line to the throne. He didn't claim the throne after his father died. He was an outsider. We're not 100% sure exactly where he came from. But he took the throne name, the king is legitimate, and then proceeds to do all of the things that you expect a good, legitimate Mesopotamian king to do. He went on campaigns, he was very pious, he built things for the gods. And one of the very interesting things he does is he puts his daughter on, he inserts his daughter into the high priestessship, high priestesshood, not sure what the term is, but he makes her high priestess of one of the cities in southern Mesopotamia, a city called 𝀭, which both honors the southern Mesopotamian religious tradition. It shows that he appreciates and values their way of life. But it also is a way that he can insert himself and insert his family's control in a traditional framework, but kind of still keep his eye on what's going on. So one of the things that you also see with him is not necessarily inscriptions, but we have a birth legend, which is essentially the Moses story. If your viewers are familiar with, I think most of them will be the
Can you tell us what Sargon's is? Because I'm sorry, I'm rabbit trailing off. I think this is I think just even focusing in on this, on the whole royal inscription thing is really interesting. But since it has relation to the Bible, and you know Myth Vision's all about that, like, what is the story of Sargon's birth, if you don't mind?
So there are a couple, but the important one here, I think, is, and these are all from later time periods. These are not like contemporary, although they quite possibly go back to Sargon's time. It is possible that this was royal propaganda that he put out and was then recorded for posterity by scribes. But he has written that he was born to a priestess, and for whatever reason she couldn't keep him, so she put him in a basket made of reeds and sealed the top with pitch and set him floating down a river. And he wasn't found by royalty like Moses is. He was found, I think, by a gardener. But then he was raised in like not like a peasant household, but it's kind of one of these princes in disguise stories. So he's raised not in royal family, and then the goddess Ishtar notices him and kind of paves the way for his greatness.
Was there any like troubling, like what we have in the Moses story, where the king or the pharaoh is trying to kill all the firstborns? So that's an added thing.
Yeah, no, that's a
Why'd she put him in the basket?
It doesn't say.
Okay.
Which is frustrating. It's actually a really short text, but it's it's got the important points, I think.
Yeah, I wonder if there's something more there that we just don't know yet.
It's possible. It's it definitely is. There's a whole load of archaeology still to be done in the area. So maybe one day we'll find out.
That's awesome. I love this. Okay, so I had a really good friend of my dad's that I had to go do some landscaping for, and he had these Catholic, I think I mentioned this last time when he had these Catholic, if you will, saints, the figurines. They literally are idols, like little Catholic idols, if you will. And he said, look, if you turn them upside down and bury them in this garden, I appreciate it. I'll throw you an extra tip. And I'm like, what's the point? Well, he just bought this house. So like this tradition, if I can use the term, it's coming from way back when.
That's old. I'm not going to say there's a direct line of continuity, but this idea is very old, because you see it in Mesopotamia, like for centuries, really. It's not just the tablets that I was mentioning earlier. Royal inscriptions can be put on pretty much anything you want. So as well as on building materials and on tablets, clay tablets, silver tablets, lapis lazuli, actually in some cases. You also have instances of inscriptions being put on figurines. So some of the more common ones are obviously figurines of kings. And they can be like tall statues made of like diorite, which is this super, super hard rock. And none of this stuff is native to Mesopotamia. So as well as the inscription itself being like a thing of power, the fact that it could be, or the fact that the kings had the resources to inscribe on this stone that needed to be quarried hundreds of miles away, brought to Mesopotamia, and then shaped and finished, it's really like a huge power play. But you have inscriptions on these big statues that would have been displayed in temple courtyards, but also on like little, maybe that big statues, which were made of clay or silver, and they often depicted the kings, sometimes like divine figures, but mostly the kings, often in like a pose, like a building pose. So they might be carrying bricks like in a basket on their head. Because symbolically, the king was the one who built the temple. He obviously didn't, but the inscriptions always frame it as the king is the one who built the temple, and there's reasonable evidence to assume that in some cases, at least, the king like laid the first ceremonial brick. So you see these statues of the king carrying bricks to be put in the temple. But where we find these statues is buried underneath the temple foundations. And they are a really important part of temple building. We have tablets that describe the rituals surrounding temple building, and these inscriptions are really, really important. And we don't just see these with royal inscriptions. You see it in domestic contexts too. So in people's houses, there's a lovely set of little dog figurines that have their names inscribed on them, and they were buried under temple houses, not temple houses, under domestic houses. And the idea was they would be apotropaic. They would protect the house from really any evil wishes or demons or things like that. And they have the best names. I think one's called. One refers to them barking at evil approaching the house or something like that. They're really, really cool.
That is awesome. One last thing on that vein, if you will, is are they putting the names of their god specifically on these inscriptions?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and that's an interesting point, actually. So, especially the building inscriptions, the inscriptions that commemorate the king building a temple, usually. The king is always building a temple for a specific god. So there's always a divine name in there somewhere, because this isn't just an act of kingship. It's not just, I'm a king, so I build temples. It's an act of extreme piety. The king in Mesopotamia was very closely tied to the religion. They were essentially the high priest of all of Mesopotamian religion. What actual priestly duties they did varies from time to time, and obviously they couldn't be present in every single temple all at once, so they had high priests kind of standing in for them. But the inscriptions frame the building work as a very personal act of devotion by the king for a specific god. And that kind of brings us on to who is supposed to be reading these inscriptions. Literacy in Mesopotamia was probably higher than you would think, and we'll probably get into that in a different video, but not everyone could read. And the people making the bricks that would have these inscriptions stamped on them quite possibly didn't read. Obviously the scribes creating the inscriptions could, but then once they were set in place, who were they for? Especially when you consider that a lot of these inscriptions were buried, or in the cases of temples, in locations where people wouldn't have easy access to them. Mesopotamian temples weren't just like open free for all. You can just walk into it like you could your like church on a Sunday. It was quite heavily guarded, and you had to have like a reason to be there. You can just like wander in and take a look around. So who are these inscriptions for? And the general consensus at the moment is that many of them were written for the gods. It didn't matter that humanity couldn't read them. It was there for the gods to remind them of the great deeds that the king did. But they were also left for like what we'd call for posterity. I mentioned earlier that it was the king's responsibility to tear down crumbling temples and rebuild them. Part of that was taking care of inscriptions that had been placed there prior to you. And you do that in the hopes that you remember the names of the kings who came before you, so that the people who come after you will remember your name also, and will take as much care with your inscriptions and with your like reputation, essentially, as you're taking with your predecessors.
Are they also kind of like, this reminds me of Game of Thrones in a way, and I always love that show, by the way. That's such a good TV series. But it always talks about the old gods and the new. And I love how it brings that up. But I wonder if sometimes they're honoring the old gods in the process, in a way of saying, look, we're bringing in our own inscriptions. So I guess, is that something possible that could be going on? We may not know that for sure. But number two is, what's the oldest inscription that we have evidence of?
So the old gods thing, probably not so much. You get in Mesopotamia a lot of what you call syncretization. So people looking at the pantheon of their city, because each city really had its own pantheon. So you look at your gods and you look at the city over to you and you look at their gods and you say, well, these two are kind of similar. They're probably the same person or same deity. These two are similar, so they're probably the same. So you kind of get a merging of all the different deities into like one. My favorite example is the goddess Ishtar, who in Sumerian is known as Inanna. She starts out as the goddess of like the grain storage, and a goddess of sex, and like reproduction in some limited cases. But then when the Akkadians come in, specifically Sargon's empire starts, the Akkadians look at their goddess Ishtar, who's a goddess of war, also goddess of sex, and the Sumerian goddess Inanna, and they say, hey, these two are pretty similar. They're probably the same goddess. Let's just kind of merge them together. So even though they use maybe different names, they're still considered to be the same, or at least to a certain extent the same. You do get different deities kind of gaining popularity. That's quite heavily tied to the political situation. So in like the time of Hammurabi of Babylon, who I suspect most people will know about, he's the guy who had the law code. The city god of Babylon was Marduk. And as Babylon's political importance increased, Marduk, as the patron god of that city, has like a similar rise in his prestige. So he doesn't erase all the gods who came before him. They're all still there to a greater or lesser extent, but they might be amalgamated with Marduk or kind of included in his mythos somehow. And you asked about the earliest inscription. The earliest ones are just names, usually. So the earliest Sumerian is generally economic tablets. But the earliest royal inscriptions are names of kings, sometimes attached to temples. You often don't have a verb, so it's just king name, temple, or maybe it's king, temple, build, to kind of record what they've done. But it's usually like a mark of ownership.
Thank you so much.